And question. Okay, so we really welcome your kind of comments and kind of, questions, at any point, if you're um not kind of comfortable appearing on the kind of video, put your questions into the kind of chat, and Jen Penza, who is our kind of coordinator of behavioral services, will read your questions, or otherwise just sort of, hit that little button that raises your arm, signals you have a question, um, and unmute yourself. So the topic of kind of perfectionism and social anxiety. We are rather lucky to have Dr. Patricia DiBartolo with us. When the latest book on perfectionism came out this June, How to Be Enough by Elaine Hendrickson. Of course, Dr. DiBartolo was quoted, in that book. She has been researching this area for many years and many kind of publications. So we're lucky to have such a kind of authority on the topic with us. So, Patty, kind of thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, Patty, I wonder if you could just kind of help set the stage a little bit in terms of how experts define kind of perfectionism and what is the kind of landscape of kind of perfection, to kind of just help us kind of orient with this kind of conversation a bit.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It is complicated. It's taken the field quite some time to figure out how to define it, because there are so many different layers to it or aspects of it. So I will say first that the way that most people talk about perfectionism nowadays is that it's multidimensional, that it's not just one thing, but rather multiple things happening at the same time. What are those multiple things? There are kind of two pieces, I think, that are the most central pieces. The one that is the most important for defining perfectionism is what I would call evaluative concerns. And that is when a person is extraordinarily fearful of mistakes and failure and other people evaluating them negatively in some way or rejecting them in some way on the basis of their performance. The other part that goes along with that is the setting of standards, really often, usually high standards for oneself. Although that's an important part of the definition of perfectionism, the setting of high standards in and of itself is not what I would consider pathological or even perfectionistic. In fact, people who set high standards for themselves often can be quite well adjusted and achieve extraordinary things in their lives. I think perfectionism is defined by those two things together, but the more important piece is that evaluative concerns piece, which I'm sure we'll get into, talking about how someone who's always afraid of disappointing others or not measuring up or being seen as inadequate or unlovable in some way because of their performance, those individuals are going to experience a great deal of emotional turmoil and anxiety. And that's basically what the literature has shown over and over again.
There are different types of kind of perfectionism, or it's been useful to kind of break that down. I wonder if you could just speak to the kind of those three different types of perfectionism that have often been described.
Yeah, so there are many different ways to define it, but there is one that's useful, I think you're referring to, which is that it depends on where the perfectionism is coming from and who it's directed towards. So there's something called self-oriented perfectionism. That's when a person, independent of environment, puts a great deal of pressure on themselves to perform well and to be perfect. There's also what's called socially prescribed perfectionism. This actually is the more pernicious part, I think, because it's when someone feels like individuals outside of themselves is pressuring them to be perfect and never to make mistakes. That's socially prescribed. And then the third kind of perfectionism is called other-oriented. It's hard to be a person in an other-oriented perfectionist life. That's when that person is always critical of other people and holding them to high standards and not very tolerant of mistakes or failure. Usually when we're mostly in the literature, we're talking a great deal about when the person is focused on their own level of kind of high standards, or they're feeling like other people are expecting that from them. Say a teacher, a coach, a parent, a tutor. Those are those two kinds, from self or from other, or where we spend most of our time in the literature.
You know, recently, Tim Curran did a kind of a study about the prevalence of kind of perfectionism, and he argues that socially prescribed perfectionism, the kind of pressure from other people, has increased dramatically and does not seem to be slowing down. And I would be curious from your perspective whether you agree with that research, whether that research makes sense, it's credible, or not, in terms of whether we really have, as I think, as some people said, a silent epidemic of perfectionism.
Yeah, some people are describing it that way, that there has been kind of a linear increase since the late 1980s, early 1990s, when we first had developed some of these measures of perfectionism. And all the measures are paper and pencil measures that where people fill out the degree to which they um whether certain statements characterize them, like making one mistake on a task is the same as complete failure, or I always set the very highest standards for myself in every circumstance. And since we developed those measures way back in the late 1980s, and in fact, we developed one of them here at Smith, I was an undergraduate when we did it, to now, and we compare young people's responses, we do see that those scores are going up and up and up and up. Um, and as you said, in the socially prescribed perfectionism, it seems credible to me, and I think there are a lot of good reasons for it. Um, Tim Curran and his colleagues talk about some of them. He talks about kind of this real focus on competitive individualism that has maybe gotten more dramatic over recent years. This notion that actually things have, at the same time we've emphasized this individual competitiveness, things have become more and more rigorous. We look at college admission rates, and those have declined significantly. So it's harder and harder to get into the same school now than it used to be years ago. The economy has gone up and down certainly over those periods of time, but it also was a little harder to get into graduate school or to get a good job and to make a decent living. So at the same time, we've seen some pressures around wage gap inequality and all those things. We're still telling people that if you just try hard enough, you can be successful. So it seems that young people are taking that on to say, I need to be perfect in order to be successful and happy and accomplished. There was also Tim Curran, and this is I think, an unfortunate characteristic of the field, which is that we're often blaming parents for that messaging. We talk about helicopter parenting, critical parenting, hyper-controlling parenting, that parents themselves are pressuring their kids to be the best at multiple things so that they can secure a happy future for them. We can go back to that. I have a more complicated sense of that. I think we do it. That's much too simplistic, kind of a set of variables that I think is causing perfectionism in children. We can talk more about that. But there is this focus on parenting having changed in the last 40 years or so. Some of you may remember a very famous New York Times bestseller about tiger momming and how that was really necessary for kids to be successful. It was written by Amy Chua, who was a law professor at Yale. So it's all of those things. The one thing they didn't mention that I thought was a glaring omission was the rise of social media and smartphone use. And I think that's been really difficult. What kids see on there, I think, can exacerbate the pressure cooker. Certainly what they're seeing on there isn't reality. It's photoshopped. It's a small sliver of life. And if they begin to judge their own success or their own performance by what they're seeing there. They're not getting a sense of reality. And I think that also makes them believe they're the only ones who are making mistakes or struggling or feeling insecure. And that was missed in the current group in their study. And but I do agree those findings are reliable. I think it is true that we are creating more. There is a culture now of perfectionism. Even the word itself, I think, it's in more use where people are often describing themselves that way. My students are here for certain in the classroom in a way that wasn't true back when I started teaching here in the 1990s.
In anticipation, I talked to some of my friends in the college counseling centers, it's at Mount Holyoke and Amherst, and they did not hesitate for 1 second saying that perfectionism was on the rise. They did not, bat an eye with regard to that.
Yeah, I think that many people are experiencing that as a phenomenon, an increasing phenomenon. And it is really marked because when we started doing research on the topic way back in the 1980s, there wasn't a lot written about it at all. And I just feel like it's really captured the attention of the media, of parents, of coaches, of teachers, therapists for certain, counseling centers for sure.
Well, it's not happening at Smith, is it?
Of course not.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just everywhere. And I think that's one other thing that I want to say about it, though, that I think here's something that I think is really important for us to acknowledge, which is that I think we have an idea of a prototype of who a perfectionist is. And it's someone who is, in fact, like high achieving, popular, amazing, multitasker. Um, because of some of the eating disorder literature, I think it's often someone who's beautiful or thin, etc. But I just want to emphasize that if there's no one group of people who are immune to perfectionism, that is, wherever we look, we find people, not everybody, but we do find people who would characterize themselves in that way. And it's not just um here's one of the paradoxes of perfectionism. I'm going to probably use that phrase over and over again. It's not just people that you would on the outside perceive as perfectionistic, because perfectionists can take such a toll. And we can talk too about the behaviors that are associated with it, which often can be procrastination and avoidance because they get so riddled with or paralyzed by their fears around failure. It actually can be something that isn't immediately obvious, but is a strong component for kids who are checking out, who are withdrawing from a sport that they loved or not auditioning for something that they used to do with some gusto or passion. And so you can find it almost everywhere, and it presents in all different kinds of ways. And it can be associated with all different kinds of emotional distress as well.
So wait, I want to come back to the issue of burnout, but what you're
Yeah,
also talking about is that there are many pathways towards perfectionism.
agree.
There's
Yep,
not just it comes in very different flavors. There is a genetic component to it.
there is.
But I wonder if you could just talk about some of the different pathways. Because a parent can have a child who seems very perfection, and they're scratching their heads in terms of
Yes.
trying to figure out where this came from.
Right. So I would say that the literature, this was my bone of contention I was mentioning earlier, that a lot of the literature, especially initially, was focusing on how parents were developing perfectionism in their own children. Even there, the story was not a simple one. There was a sense that you might have parents like Amy Chua's tiger parenting, where they were criticizing their children all the time if they weren't perfect. So that was one example. You might also then, they talked about how if parents are role modeling that themselves, if they are intolerant or in front of their children, talk about how a mistake is terrible, that might be the case. But even early on, there was this recognition. I think it came primarily from some clinical cases that individuals who came from families in which the parents were abusive or neglectful could develop perfectionism as a coping mechanism. That is, if a parent were neglectful, the child might try to engage, might develop some perfectionism as a means maybe of drawing their positive attention rather than being ignored in some way. And the same thing with an abusive parent, that a parent might, if the child were perfect, that the parent wouldn't lash out at the child, right? So a whole variety of different kinds of parenting approaches. But I just have to say, one thing that wasn't discussed at all is that there are some parents who are like, where did this perfectionist come from? Like, I don't think they get it from us. We're constantly talking to them about self-compassion. We're not telling them that they're not good enough, but this child is one who seems to get really upset and has always been that way. And so I think it is important to recognize that there are all different pathways. It could, in fact, come from some messaging they're getting within the family itself, but it might also come from other places. It might come from the child's peer group or a particular idiosyncratic experience they had growing up in some way. It could come from an environment they're in. If they tend to be really good at something and they're in kind of a place with rarefied air, if they're on a travel league for athletics, or if they're in all AP classes, they might then tend to be in an environment that fosters it. So there are many different pathways, I think, toward perfectionism that we shouldn't assume we understand how a child or a person has gotten there just because we see the set of behaviors I'm describing as perfectionistic. That is, we shouldn't be thinking that we understand what their parenting was like or anything else about their history, because there are a variety of different variables that seem to encourage or exacerbate this particular approach. And one other thing I just want to highlight before you ask a follow-up is about this genetic component. There are kids who seem to have temperaments that are more predisposed to this type of thinking. There is a genetic component. So if you look at twins, identical twins, they tend to be similar in their concerns about mistakes or a fear of failure, but they're not perfectly concordant in that way. So even the genetic component is only one small piece. It doesn't tell the whole entire story. And specifically, it seems that what kids are inheriting is this temperamental approach. There are some kids who seem to be more worried about making mistakes and more sensitive to rewards than are other children who might be more risk-taking or more oblivious to getting in trouble. We probably all have seen these, depending on what our vantage point is, either in our own families or on the playground if we're a teacher. And so kids who have more of that temperament where they're very sensitive to rewards, they are very excited by gold stars, by pats on the back. Those kids might actually be a little more vulnerable to developing perfectionism. And certainly kids who don't like getting in trouble, don't like a raised eyebrow or a sense they've disappointed anyone, also might be vulnerable. But that in and of itself, again, is probably not going to mean that they're destined to have a later childhood or adulthood filled with perfectionistic concerns. It's really only that in interaction with some of these other variables that probably result. So I think you're absolutely right to talk about the pathways are varied and they're not simple. Every story is a little bit different, but there are these reliable kind of variables that are often involved in some way or another. It's just not that we can tell one story for what it looks like for someone who develops into a perfectionist.
Is there such, people will often ascribe their success to the fact that they're perfectionistic.
Yes.
And people like you have the nerve to suggest that they should sort of revise that when that's the kind of thing that's made them successful. I mean,
Yes.
isn't perfectionism essential to be successful?
Yes. Yes. This is one of the most kind of enduring misconceptions that perfectionists have, because what we see, over and over again with people who are perfectionistic is that it may, perhaps for a period of time, kind of the relentless, hard driving approach they take to trying to be perfect in every instance might mean that they do encounter some success.
Mm,
But you mentioned burnout earlier, and
mm,
there are real costs to maintaining that particular approach. Perfectionists believe it's because they hold these rigid beliefs and approaches to themselves and to the world that they're successful. And I would say they're probably successful in spite of that, and that ultimately there will be costs, because what we do know about perfectionism is that almost without fail, it's associated with significant emotional costs, and of all different kinds. It has Perfectionism has been associated with almost every kind of clinical diagnosis that
mm.
exists, everything from eating disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, suicidality, um, alcohol use, and there was even a large scale study that was done up in Canada that found that people who were perfectionistic actually had worse mortality rates. They died younger. There are health concerns that are associated with it as well, everything from migraine to coronary artery disease. So although it may be something that someone could imagine is useful in the short term, in the long term, it tends to leave kind of a wake of destruction and despair. And in fact, not only that, perfectionists often don't even get any satisfaction from success, because it's never good enough. So as soon as they achieve something, they often are looking to how they need to be even better the next time, or they need to change their comparison group to be even more competitive than it had been before. So, where they focus on even a tiny little mistake, even if they did extraordinarily well, their MVP for the game, they might think about the shot that they missed. And so there's very little benefit to embracing what is called perfectionism, either in terms of objective success or in terms of like emotional well-being. And I think the hard part though is that people who are perfectionistic believes that it brings them riches, or it'd be the only reason why they've been successful, or it's be the only reason why they may be successful in the future.
I think also we get confused about this issue because we our attention gets focused on successful people like Steve Jobs.
Yep.
And we don't, there's not a lot about press about the everyday kind of perfectionistic who gets burnt out and um, quietly, gets burnt out. We tend to kind of focus, that we've got to be as demanding as Steve Jobs, who's sort of a poster boy for a certain type of perfectionism. And we don't see the kind of the cost it takes on the everyday individual, about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I think that's true. And right, the famous saying, don't ever judge your insides by other people's outsides, even if there's someone who looks like they're, super successful because they are relentless, et cetera. But we don't know what they're experiencing internally and what might be happening between their ears, in terms of ruminating on mistakes and putting a tremendous amount of pressure on themselves and experiencing, you know, um, difficulty sleeping and other kinds of emotional symptoms. So I think you're right that there is this notion that there are some people who have been successful because of their kind of relentless pursuit of perfection. But honestly, most people who are able to, even the high profile folks you're talking about, like say extraordinarily successful athletes who are able to succeed, in order to maintain that level of competition, they have to figure out a way to engage in kind of self-compassion and to problem solve in the face of adversity or difficulty. And I think sometimes perfectionists don't recognize that. So I think one important message often, to individuals who are really feeling, caged by perfectionism, is the emphasis on kind of balance, compassion, flexibility, problem solving, like forgiveness around making mistakes. You and I think were speaking earlier about how perfection is basically not humanly possible to be perfect all the time. You know, I often tell my students that there may be moments, like these little slivers of time, where you've done something perfectly. Maybe you have a piano recital, you think you totally hit it or whatever, but those moments are extraordinarily rare. We're actually, as human beings, we're more likely to make mistakes. And so the idea is learning how to absorb them, how to learn from them, how not to cause them to steal all our joy, but to experience compassion. And I think the other piece of it is that for perfectionists, their sense of self, their essential sense of self, is often very much tied to their latest performance. So at their core, sometimes they can really struggle with feeling lovable, feeling like they're worthwhile human beings independent of what their latest performance has been, and that people will only love them if they are perfect, if they appear perfect. And I think that core belief is one that definitely needs to get shaken up a little bit, in order for perfectionists. It has to be addressed before perfectionists will think that the only answer to life is to continue to try to always achieve high standards and never to make mistakes.
It would seem to me that social anxiety is just all about perfectionism, because that you harbor this concern with one wrong mistakes are really not acceptable. Is that a fair take on just social anxiety?
I think it's a pretty fair take. I think, yeah, it's kind of a logic puzzle, because I think you're right, from my perspective and a lot of the literature in the field, what defines social anxiety in people is the sense that their standards for themselves, or what they expect other people, other what they think other people expect of them in social situations, are not what they're going to be able to achieve. So they become very afraid of criticism, of rejection in those social situations, whether a public speaking engagement, or a date, or other kind of interaction, social media exchange. So in essence, that's kind of what I'm saying perfectionism is. For some people, though, their perfectionism doesn't result in social anxiety. It may be something that comes out in another way. They may not have a social, let me put it this way, they may not have a social anxiety disorder, a diagnosable social anxiety disorder, but it may instead result in something a little bit different. It may express itself through an eating disorder, or use of drugs or alcohol to numb the constant rumination and worry that they have, and the self-criticism. So it is true that I think perfectionism and social anxiety are like hand in glove, but that perfectionism actually can express itself all different kinds of ways.
And if somebody is perfectionistic, it doesn't mean that they're perfectionistic in all areas of their life.
Yes, right, exactly. You and I have discussed that, that it could be kind of domain specific for certain, right? That someone could be really perfectionistic about their athletic performance. They see that as a sense of an important part of their identity, and so tend to be very perfectionistic there and not care so much about schoolwork. You can find
Or
some,
how their room looks at
or
home.
how their room looks.
Right.
Absolutely, right. So there has been a lot of discussion about how there can be domain specificity around perfectionism, and sometimes even that can confuse people, because parents might say, I don't really understand why, my child is this way about the soccer league, but could care less about all the rest of the things, whether it's physical appearance, how the room looks, what their schoolwork is doing. But you can find people who have it kind of a little bit of it everywhere. But it is true. It could be more focused. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with identity, right? So, what's important to the individual, how they're judging themselves. And so that is true too with adults. There's a lot of conversation about how parenting might create that same thing, that parents can sometimes judge themselves really harshly. They might be generous with themselves at work or in other areas of their lives, but around parenting, they might be really self-critical about mistakes. that they've made because being a good parent is so important to them. So the same thing is true with youth, that you may find that they tend to be perfectionistic in one area, not another.
You probably, one more question before we kind of just survey the
Yes,
audience for kind of
please.
question. The issue of procrastination, it seems to me that the topic of perfectionism has a lot of important things and a different slant on kind of the issue of procrastination, not necessarily being an issue in time management, but something altogether different. And I wonder if you could just talk about, you know, the place that procrastination plays with perfectionism.
There is a strong relationship. And you're right, for some individuals, it is just a time management issue. They lose track of time, didn't realize how big the task was, not good, maybe at executive functioning and laying things out end to end organizationally for some kind of task. And then ultimately they've let it go a little too long. But there's also a kind of a way in which procrastination can be particular to perfectionism. And that is that, as it may very well be that a perfectionistic starts early and begins a big school project. But every time they get near it or address it, it feels like they're not going to be good enough at it. Or as they write the first paragraph, it just doesn't sound smart enough. And so they often can put it off. They'll leave it because they start to get anxiously aroused and it becomes distressing, and they're discomforted by it. So they might put it away as a way of avoiding, and that avoidance then takes away sometimes the worries and the stress until it gets too overwhelming and the deadline comes too close. So there is a way in which perfectionism and procrastination are really tied. And interestingly, in that instance, because that looks paradoxical, doesn't it? That someone who's perfectionistic would be putting it off because they are intimidated by it when they're trying to be good at it. They're trying maybe to get a good grade or be well prepared for something. But the fact is that sometimes that's what happens with perfectionists. And it can create these moments of really intense, kind of overwhelming falling apart for children and for adults, where it is the day before a big paper is due and they haven't done as much as they should have. And they really can have, a panic, a crying jag, etc., because they've been putting it off and putting it off. It is probably a worthwhile thing as a parent or teacher, therapist to have the hypothesis or to wonder about whether part of what is getting in the way of kids being proactive in their work or their approaches to things, whether it is perfectionism. It might not be for some children at all, but at least to think about it, because on its face, sometimes it doesn't look like they really are caring, because if they were taking a proactive approach, they would have long ago gotten over the hump. But when what they're hearing in their head is all this catastrophic worry and anxious arousal, what it does is it often pushes them past the edge of productivity, right? I haven't talked with my students about this notion of kind of what's a learning edge, that a little bit of anxiety can get you motivated to get things done. But once you start to really feel anxious and you're really telling yourself all these negative things about how nothing is good enough and you're never going to get it right and you're going to fail the assignment, then that gets to a point where no one can really be productive. So it's not surprising then that a perfectionist might slink away and put it off for the next a different day. But on its face, it just looks like they don't care. It could look like they don't care. And so it's worthwhile to think a little bit about that if you see that happening with a student. Because I have had students who've dropped out of Smith, for example, because they've been so perfectionistic. So those two things don't seem to go together. Most people probably wouldn't think that perfectionists are individuals who need to withdraw from college, but it happens because it becomes such a chronic, overwhelming, interfering issue.
And often in those moments, of kind of dreading putting off something, we then substitute something else to kind of make ourselves feel better, whether it's playing Minecraft or cleaning the house or whatever. We kind of we substitute something else to kind of make ourselves. It's sort of an emotional management strategy in a way.
Absolutely. And I think, when kids are younger too, obviously developmentally they don't have access to always what's happening internally, right? That self-reflective process is something we develop over time as we become developmentally more mature, have more cognitive flexibility and insight. And so sometimes it can be really hard to understand what's happening in a kid's head when you're observing them from the outside. But as kids age, they're usually better and better, assuming they're feeling like they're talking with a trusted individual adult, at being more self-aware of how those things are happening. And so it's useful to be able to help them to see it and to acknowledge it, to tell them that, you know, in some ways it's about normalizing how if they were feeling that way and thinking all those things, of course they couldn't get their paper written because all of that might be interfering, and that it would be the problem is about helping to address what's going on in their head so that it doesn't interfere as regularly as often, which might be, you know, supportive parenting. It could be coaching in the right way. It could be if a child is really struggling and a family feels like even with those kind of supportive moments that the child is not changing, it might be an idea to go seek out professional help, therapy and counseling, to broaden the range of skills that a child and a family might have to address some of that cycle.
Let's pause and just see if there's anyone in the audience that would have questions or would like to add some comments or have some observations of their own that they want to add or say. You don't have to be, but it's kind of just fun if there are, you know, some comments. That we'd love to hear them.
There's one in the chat. It says the putting off stops when the anxiety of not doing is finally greater than the anxiety produced by starting to do it. And it looks like Lisa has her hand up. Lisa, if you want to unmute, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm coming from I guess a different space. My son is autistic, with high support needs. And so he's a perfectionist in a lot of ways, if you can use that word. I see it more as a nervous system, rigid, inflexible thing. That's the way I've come to understand. He's 11 now, but so much of the conversation is connecting it to social, like a self-identity in relationship to the larger group, which my son does not have. Yet he still has these perfectionist characteristics and traits that started early on, right? So like those tiny toddlers who, if they can't get that circle in the thing and flip out and they're explosive, or if they're coloring and they can't, and then that just continues on. So I'm coming from it from a different perspective. And so I wonder how much of it can be reframed in terms of nervous system and anxiety, and not just the social identity or the relation to the larger social group. And also just as an aside, the idea of fixed mindset versus like the growth mindset. So all those parents out there who have been reading all the books and doing all the honoring of the effort and not the product, and their kids are still perfectionists, like, I see you. We exist.
Yes. So thank you so much for the comment and the question. I think you're absolute. There are so many nuggets in there that let me see if I can make sure I address a few of them. One is, I do think that it can often be this one that is more grounded in kind of biological pieces, as you're saying, kind of nervous system, temperament, other sensory processing issues for certain. So I think you're right that there are some, right. So what you're saying is this is a different pathway. And I would just acknowledge, yes, that your child's example is a great example of how not all two people are exactly the same when they have perfectionistic tendencies at all. The other thing I wanted to say was about the developmental piece of it. You were talking about a tiny little, like, how is it a toddler could? And the fact is that many people are perfectionists. Not all, again, developmental pathways can be different, but there are many people who remember always being that way, or parents who say they've always been that way since they were little. And so, young children, like a pre-K child who is doing art and then is frustrated because it doesn't look just like the picture in the book, which is, a Van Gogh or something along those lines, that you can find kids from very, very young ages. Sometimes it develops later on, and that can happen because of a change environment, a more competitive environment, or there's been some other kind of environmental trigger, but people think about it as a personality trait or a cognitive trait that is often present lifelong. One thing that I should say in the long run is that there haven't been as many studies about it longitudinally, like from the very beginning of life, very young children, all the way up through adulthood. But there have been a couple of studies, and I think that what's interesting is that what they're finding in general is that perfectionism tends to decrease as individuals age. But I think it's like well into adulthood. Maybe it's the wisdom of living life or developing new coping resources, but for many people, it does soften its edges a little bit. But I don't think that's true for everyone, especially if it is related more to kind of, basic biological processes. But I think that's a really good point. And the last point that I want to say is that perfectionism is dogged, right? So you were saying, even if you're trying your best as a parent or teacher to focus on growth mindset, to think about mistakes as opportunities for learning, to talk about how fixed mindset actually doesn't help a learner very much at all. Those are all really great perfectionistic busting lessons, but because perfectionism is kind of is often a dispositional way of viewing the world, that kind of lesson doesn't always get absorbed in the same way in a perfectionistic mind. So I think you're right that there are ways in which, even despite your best efforts as a teacher, counselor, parent, loved one of someone who's perfectionistic, it might not land the way we want it to. And again, I think it can have an influence over time, but I think it's just kind of continuing the message as much as possible, making sure that you have everyone swimming in kind of the same direction with you, so they're not getting mixed messages where a coach is somehow reinforcing perfectionistic approaches when you at home are trying to cultivate self-compassion. And then again, if it's still not working, then pulling in, say, professionals who can help to work with the child and help you to think about whether there are any coping strategies that you haven't yet assessed. But thank you. Yeah, your comments very helpful.
Sharon, you had a comment, and I wonder, Sharon Sleen, whether you'd be willing to kind of just say it out loud. You're muted at the moment.
Hi, Ted. Hi, Patty. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
And hi, Jen. Nice to see you too. This is a great topic. And my comment was actually love to interview you about this, Patty, for my next book. That I see a lot of social anxiety and perfectionism in kids with ADHD and neurodivergence. And I'm wondering why you think these might co-occur. There's of course the overlap of fixed mindsets and black and white thinking and sort of catastrophizing and of course procrastination. But I'm just curious, in your world, what's the thinking about this?
It's a great question. I think it's probably complicated. Again, for two different sets of people, the reasoning is different for why there's a connection. I think that to some degree, what we do know about children and individuals who have ADHD is that sometimes they are experiencing impairments, right? In schoolwork, they're forgetting things, they're missing deadlines, they're perhaps not paying attention as well as they should to the rules of the classroom, the rules of probably social engagements, et cetera. And that part of that might result in them experiencing some negative feedback. And, everyone wants to be, again, accepted, well liked, successful. And when kids have some of those struggles, it might actually heighten their sense that next time I'm gonna be as perfect as I possibly can, and then maybe I can avoid that from happening. So I think that that can often result that sometimes the impairments that are associated with some of the exec functioning issues that go along with ADHD can result in grabbing onto perfectionism potentially as a way of coping a bit. And for some people, like organizational strategies are not the same as perfectionism. I should probably be clear. This is a good moment to say that some people say they're perfectionistic because they like things color coded and their pantry spices are in alphabetical order, and kids have, all of their lockers very neat. Organization and being kind of on top of yourself in your life in that way is not perfectionism, although people might describe it that way. So I think sometimes people think that if you're perfectionistic, then you are going to be highly effective and organized and responsible. But those are very different things. Those actually don't overlap in a variety of different ways. In other words, you can be very, very organized, not at all perfectionist, be very, very perfectionist and not all organized. So I think it's probably related to the whole host of kind of struggles that people can have with ADHD in the social realm and in the work and school realm that probably creates the co-occurrence. But I think this is also another example, Sharon, I'm not sure how much you've seen in the literature, because I think, again, on its face, no one expected that individuals with ADHD, who sometimes can have trouble being organized, right, being successful in school and schoolwork and other kinds of things, that they could be perfectionistic, because we think of it in a certain way. We think it's the highly successful straight A student who is perfectionistic, and that's not always the case. Not to say that individuals with ADHD can't be straight A students, because many of them are. But I think sometimes it's just we don't think of them as going together. So I don't know that we know enough about that story yet, but I think there's something really important there for all of us to explore.
Yes, I mean, I have read a bunch about this, and I've read the research, and I've written about this myself. And I do find it pretty fascinating that perfectionism is, when it's toxic or maladaptive, it's an unhealthy coping style. And often what happens is it sort of starts out as something positive, like, oh, I really want to get this right and do a good job. And then the efforts don't kind of meet the ideal that you have in your head. And so then you might give up, or you become very anxious about actually finishing because it's never quite done enough. But I see this a lot, and I really appreciate your response. And I'll follow up and see if there's anything you want to direct me to read. That would be great. But it's a big issue, and because there's a lot of anxiety around, making a mistake that you didn't know you were you didn't know you were making a mistake, but then you got feedback that you were, and so now you have to make sure everything is aligned correctly.
It's almost like it's kind of a cousin of the experience of children growing up in an abusive household, where they really strive to be perfect in order not to get in trouble.
Yes, that's right.
I see a comment in the chat from Jan
so
about that very thing. Yep.
Jen, could you help us out with a question from the chat, or perhaps invite the person who wrote that to kind of just to say it out loud? Or
Sure. Yeah, Jan, if you wanna
Yeah, I think,
elaborate on that.
you know how sometimes when we go through cycles in our country, but like we've become aware of militaristic language, that makes me so mad, I just want to kill you, or, but it seems like, we can shift the curiosity about trying to use less absolute language, like even saying, oh yeah, that plan, that's perfect. Well, it's a plan. There's no perfect plan. So maybe we actually need to be more thoughtful about the language that we use, so that we don't have that tyranny of self, just that expectation that we will meet what we say. We have to use different language so we're not so hard on ourselves. because I feel like materialistic is one thing. I want as much or more than others. Militaristic, it's outward, like I want to compete and win. And then there's the tyranny of the way we talk to ourselves, can be just awful. And so we literally have to practice using different vocabulary, I think.
I think that's an excellent point. And sometimes some of the strategies that therapists can use and parents and teachers can use is to monitor carefully the use of those words. So you are talking about the tyranny of the absolute. Some people talk about in the literature, like Dr. Beck talks about the tyranny of the should. I should have been better. I shouldn't have done this. I must do this. I can't do that. All of that word creates this sense of there's nothing acceptable besides this one particular outcome. And I think you're right. It creates just such a kind of a narrow definition of what is appropriate, that oftentimes it just backs you into a corner. So I think watching the language often is meaningful. It often can give you an insight into how they're feeling inside about what they expect of themselves or think other people's expect of them in order to, again, be, kind of lovable, acceptable, valued in some way. And so I think you're absolutely right. Watching language is important and can give you insights. I would say if you're seeing a kid who's like, I have to, I should, I shouldn't have, then you can imagine what's happening. And a lot of times, I often use this as an intervention with my students and in therapy with my own kids around, would you ever talk to a good friend that way? Or would you ever judge a good friend that way? Just because oftentimes the self-compassion is missing when the perfectionism rears its head. There's no generosity toward oneself. That criticism can actually be quite withering. And so it's often helping them to have some distance from it is that if you, would you ever talk to your best friend that way? Would I ever let you talk to your brother that way? Helps them to see that maybe the way that they're treating themselves is one that is particularly harsh and maybe can help to disrupt it and loosen it a little bit.
We do have, Aviva's had her hand up for quite a while, so if you'd like to unmute and go ahead and ask your question or your comment.
Thanks. It had a little bit to do with the ADHD topic, so thanks for that insight. And then there was another comment in the chat that I'm hoping, I have a similar question about sort of tactics to use with young children who seem to have, some perfectionist tendencies, as that person wrote, and how to respond to it. I don't know. I mean, that can also be sort of like very individual to the child, but for example, my almost 6-year-old is she gets quite frustrated when she's working on something and it doesn't, turn out how she had envisioned it. And this is the first time she's doing something, to the point of like throwing things across the room and saying that saying, I'm stupid, I'm bad, I'm horrible, I can't do anything right. It just started happening in the past maybe year or so. And I just don't really know how to respond. So again, I hope that this is appropriate for like a group talk like this, but I'm just curious if, there are sort of kind of general strategies of how to deal with something like that before it turns into something larger. And I will say we also suspect that she will have an ADHD diagnosis at some point.
Well, Patty, why don't I jump in with
Go
some?
ahead, please.
So, couple of kind of thoughts. First of all, in terms of kind of parent books and stuff like that, I have some specific thoughts about what is helpful. For her age, books by Dawn Hubner tend to be quite good, and she's written a book called Facing Mighty Fears About Making Mistakes. I don't know if you can kind of see that. But she starts off in the book with a great idea, which is step number one, is to develop for the family to develop a different vocabulary about making mistakes. So, everybody in the family hopefully would begin to model when they make mistakes using words like "oops," "shucks," "fiddlesticks," "oy vey," "gosh," "fiddlesticks," or "oh well," whatever. But using a lot of whoopsie doops kind of state with regard to kind of making mistakes as kind of a first step in terms of just but in the moment, I think as with all kind of high intensity moments, they're not going to be very responsive to kind of any logic. And I think we just need at that moment kind of connect with them and be kind of empathic and say, that was really disappointing, or that was really, that wasn't what you kind of hoped. But this book would be one I would kind of, for younger kids. The second book would be for slightly older kids, What to Do When Mistakes Make You Quake.
Ted, can you write those in the chat when you get a sec?
Yeah, I can. And then for slightly older kids, 13, 14, A Perfectionist Guide to Not Being Perfect by Bonnie Zucker. And then finally for college and for adults, I think Ellen Hendrickson's recent book, How to Be Enough, is actually quite good. She's quite comprehensive, and I mean, what's not to like? She quotes Dr. Bartolo in her book, so she's on the right track. So I'll
Thank
write
you.
this in the track, and maybe other people can respond to this in the chat, and other people can.
I was just going to add one thing, Ted, which is that, perfectionists are monitoring mistakes their own all the time. And I think that one other intervention that you could play with a bit as a family is to actually make mistakes on purpose, not dangerous mistakes or super costly mistakes, but little mistakes here and there, so that you can show kids that you can make a mistake and go, oh gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. I should have let that person go first at the stop sign. Oh, wow, I made a mistake there. Next time, I will be sure to let that person go first. Instead, so that they can see the modeling of, first off, that they start to see that mistakes happen all the time everywhere, right? Secondly, that you could model how you react. And then thirdly, I think it helps them to develop their own language for how to deal with it. But there are going to be, again, it's almost similar to the comment just a minute ago that Lisa shared, which is that for some kids, it's going to take a long time. You're not going to be able to do it for a week, and they're going to say, you're right, mistakes are great, and they help me to be a better person, and sometimes they happen. But it can help people to sometimes loosen their sense that they're absolutely unacceptable, that they're catastrophic in some way, that they're a measure of someone being an awful human being, which can sometimes be the way they feel about themselves. So it could be an innocuous mistake. In social anxiety, sometimes it's about doing something silly, like getting in the elevator and facing the wrong way, which is just a small social faux pas, but it is obviously out of line with the way we do it. And just to get people to see, like, they could make a mistake like that, that's really obvious. And yet when they get off the elevator, they haven't died of embarrassment. So there may be some of those too. And that you can think about as a family, maybe even agree with an elementary school teacher that a child's going to be making some mistakes on the math homework that week, and figure out if there's a way you could manage that without it, really negatively influencing their experiences of school. So the question was bigger about on a day-to-day basis with children who have perfectionistic tendencies. I think that if you think about some of the things we've already discussed, which I think is about making them less concerned about mistakes. That's one of the definitional pieces of it, which is just to see it as being normal, expected, and even when it is a true mistake with some disappointment associated with it, thinking about how to recover from that and be compassionate, and make maybe a better plan and learn from it. So helping them to be better making mistakes is one piece. I think associated with it too is that the piece, to the degree to which you feel like it may be a way in which they're feeling like they're going to be rejected, or that they're not valued in some way. It's giving them those messages that I always love you. It doesn't matter that you just made a mistake. Of course, I always love you in this family. And giving them opportunities to be in spaces where they develop, relationships or interests that help them to feel kind of connected even when they are making mistakes. I think those things are important things to do day to day with kids. And just as I was saying earlier, having everyone swimming in the same direction. So talking at parent-teacher conferences, if you have a kid who tends to be hard on themselves, talking with a coach or a tutor, or even like if they have a tight-knit friend group, the families of the parents of their closest friends, just to figure out whether you can make sure that they're not getting messages that are undermining them. I think also social media literacy is probably important in this regard too, helping kids to develop skills around busting what they see as this, it is a veneer of perfection that they're often getting lambasted with day to day if they're on social media, on Instagram, on Snapchat, etc. To see whether you can help them engage literacy about how what they're seeing is not really real. That is cultivated moments of self-presentation, because when they're young, they don't have that kind of perspective. Other questions or comments?
I'll jump in with one question.
Please.
We have a daughter who has been dealing with anxiety for the past couple of years, and in this more recent year, there have been a couple of those scenarios that are very much what you were talking about the perfectionism and the procrastination, just getting really stuck with a certain assignment or two. Usually, it's more of a writing type situation where it's sort of a bigger project, um, less so with a math or science type situation. But I'm just curious, is that perfectionist, procrastination tendency, do you see that as a byproduct of just dealing with anxiety in general? Or is that just something different? I guess they kind of go hand in hand to some extent. We're just trying to figure out, she's not on any medications, and but that's sort of creeping because of some recent struggles in this regard. The medication is starting to become part of the conversation, and just trying to get a better handle on that. Any thoughts would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, obviously, the whatever professional with whom you've been consulting is probably the best person who has the most complex and complete picture of what is best for your child. It's very much a chicken and egg question for any child, like which comes first, anxiety or perfectionism or anxiety. Sometimes, they co-occur over the life course, but there is a point at which they both are in a particular child, in which case you can tackle them in often the same kind of approaches, tackle both of them simultaneously, because again, they're often so tightly connected to one another. About the, writing in particular, I find that the more complicated the task is, the more and the harder it is to know whether you're right or not right. I almost feel like that is really fertile ground for perfectionism. in some ways, even though you would think that if it were a math worksheet where they could see really clearly and easily, maybe the answers online and know, did they get 9 out of 10 right or 10 out of 10, that might actually feed perfectionism. I think it's ambiguous situations where they can't monitor how effective they're doing, that when they're perfectionistic, that's when their thoughts and self-doubts tend to crowd out much of what they're experiencing. And the more complicated the task is, the more likely that is to happen. So writing is a big one, I think, because it is so complicated. And as you're in the middle of it, it's really hard to know if you're writing something strong. And writing is a big process. Anybody who writes in any way knows that you never nail it like right away. It's this, but perseverative process before you feel like it's any good. And even then, sometimes you're not entirely clear. So sometimes I talk with my students who are procrastinating because of perfectionistic things around getting assignments, writing assignments done. We talk a little bit about what they need to deliver. To me, is you could make this language developmentally appropriate, but I call it like a cruddy draft. Like I don't want a good draft. What I want by next Wednesday is a cruddy draft, because you have to get through the cruddy to get to good. And even that helps to re-establish something for them, because I think sometimes they think they should start at the first word and write the 500 words and then be done with it, instead of understanding that it really is this building block process and it is iterative. And so perhaps that might help to free things up slightly, is to say, well, you have a 2-page essay due next Wednesday. By 2 days from now, let's have a cruddy first draft of the first page, or let's have an outline. So the degree to which you can help them to break that down, where they're not expecting it to be perfect in any way. No one would be expecting them to be perfect at that stage. I think that can sometimes be useful for something like that. I would sometimes, I have had a student once describing to me that in trying to write a first paragraph or something for an assignment, it was even a cruddy draft, that what she was doing was writing the first sentence, writing the second sentence, going back to the first sentence and reading it and realizing that the first sentence wasn't good enough, erasing it, looking at a blank page, starting over again, new first sentence, second sentence, third sentence, goes back to the beginning, still not any better, erases the whole thing. So you could even try to put some guidance in place, which is like, let's not erase anything right now. Your goal is to just write for, tonight. And then afterwards, that's when you do the editing. The editing is a different process. What you're just doing now is just putting things down on paper. And the idea here is it doesn't need to be very good, but that's not your worry at the moment. It's just putting down ideas. And the next stage is the editing stage. And that habit can sometimes break things up for perfectionists as well. And sometimes it's intensive periods. So they can be exhausted sitting at the kitchen table for hours and hours. And you look and you're like, what have you been doing for the last X number of time? That can be exacerbated, certainly if they have ADHD or other distractibility, but sometimes it can literally be this kind of vicious self-destructive cycle. So you could instead do, all we're doing tonight is 20 minutes of writing, no erasing, just write, stream of consciousness, and then we'll put it down. And tomorrow will be a point at which we could go back and reread and rework. And that might help to free up just enough for you to have something to work with. Because I think as a parent, the part that's hardest is when there's nothing for you to kind of grab onto to help them to move it in the right direction, because they're so stuck in that cycle.
No, that's
Is
super
any of that
helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I
Okay.
think another piece of this is a little frustrating, is that I think there is an element of her wanting to fix it herself and do it herself, as opposed to, and I don't know if that's part of the perfectionism, but not, willing to listen to us, but not really, if we come up with some ideas of things, approaches she might take, it's, sometimes I feel like she disregards them because she wants to figure it out on her own.
Yep.
but I appreciate all your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. One other thing that I would say is that perfectionists don't want other people to see their imperfections, even people close with them, when they value them, right? Because often in their own belief system, a mistake is evidence of incapacity, etc. They might not want a teacher to know they're struggling. And so they may not disclose it when in fact the very best thing they can do for themselves is to ask the teacher for some help, stay after school. Same thing even with parents, right? That sometimes they just don't want other people to see their mistakes. The mistakes are feeling like feel so big and loaded for them that it can be really hard sometimes. There's some evidence that perfectionists who go into therapy sometimes don't respond as well, because if they continue to engage in this, I'm going to hold really close to the vest the very things that I'm most worried about. So I think the more that the one important part of like the growth mindset, and I think about helping perfectionists to address some of their maladaptive concerns, is how everyone benefits from support, community, working with others, sharing their ideas, exposing their vulnerabilities, the degree to which you can help kids to see that that's the way most people become successful, figure out how to problem solve, that this is a normal expected part of the way that we navigate the world, that can also be helpful too. And again, for some kids that's easier than others. Some kids are like, great, I'll go to after school help, and they're fine. But I think for perfectionists, it might take them some convincing. And so I think in that instance, it might be particularly important if you can find like the educator who's particularly supportive and sensitive, rather than maybe the hard driving math teacher who's like no nonsense and difficult, for the first reach out around help, if at all possible, so that they get good feedback, rather than someone who's a little gruff in supporting a kid who's trying to reach out for a little bit of help.
Thank you very much.
Yep. I also love the comments are wonderful in terms of helping kids to think about mistakes and failures as being productive. I love some of the examples here about developing kind of bravery in these moments of challenge because they're inevitable, or how mistakes are sometimes the way that we develop insight and awareness and advances in a variety of different kinds of ways. And so I think that you can't, it's hard to develop kind of real innovation, real sophisticated thinking without being willing to make mistakes. And so there may be ways in which you can help students see that too. In my field, I often tell my students that we do something that's called peer review, which is that we show our stuff to other people and they criticize it. And that we need to be able to absorb their feedback to make our science better, so that we can share it and advance knowledge, because we want good knowledge to go forward, not bad knowledge. So we need other people to push and prod on our ideas. That's part of what it means to be in the field of psychology. So I tell my students all the time, if you think of other people providing you feedback or questioning your logic as being something that means that your work isn't good or you don't have the capacity to succeed, that's misunderstanding. This is what we do all the time. And it's a badge of honor and respect that other people take the time to do this for you and allow you to make your ideas better. And so in fact, Ted comes to my classes where he asks questions of my students that I don't know what he'll be asking them. And I say, this is what we do in psychology, is people are allowed to ask us questions because we're trying to develop ideas about how humans function and how best to help them. So we want to make sure that we're coming up with the best thinking. And so we have to not be afraid of people asking us questions that are hard for us, or us making mistakes, or having incomplete thoughts, that this process is part of becoming successful in the long run. And that often is a real big shift for them because they're used to wanting it to be just right.
In a prior workshop, we were talking about sports performance. And one of the, phrases that one of the participants used was that failure is the breakfast of champions.
Yes.
You know, obviously trying that's how we learn. But failure and feedback is the breakfast of champions.
Yeah, and at Smith and at other places too, you may have heard a little bit about schools that are taking approaches to failure, that they're doing failure projects. Where what they're doing is they're asking people in their community, like professors, to talk about how they, economists who are highly successful, talking about how they got an F the first time they took microeconomics and what they did in response. We're all making that we're sharing our CVs of failure too, that some people have done that. Like, this paper is published, but you didn't see that it got rejected 5 times previous to it actually getting published. So everyone could actually understand how it is that as you're saying, it's the breakfast of champions. Like, there are not successful people who haven't gotten over those kinds of hurdles. They're inevitable. They're inevitable just because we fail, but also just because life is riddled with adversity and trauma and pandemic and so on and so forth, that make it harder for us to succeed. And so I think even that can be very helpful too, as you're mentoring or talking with young people, is the ways in which it's just inevitable, and people's stories about how the failure might have caused them to go in a different direction that is, has helped to define their life's work, or that they said, I don't care that I just failed that class. I love this so much. I'm going to stay in it. I find it fascinating. I had a student once who went on and got a PhD in psychology after someone told her that her D in statistics in her first semester here at Smith, as a first generation college student, that meant that she would never get into graduate school. And she took that as a challenge and said, I will show you, and did. So that sharing these stories sometimes can be really quite useful, because when you look at people on paper, it looks like it was just a straight, easy line of, brilliance, rather than what we know when we live it, which is that was a long, hard road littered with failures and mistakes. And we've persevered in a way that makes good sense. Right. I love that, the pedagogy of vulnerability. I have a colleague here who talks about to teach with compassionate grace, which is that we give one another grace in those spaces to make mistakes, to know that that's going to happen, whether we're the professor or the student, and we still have things to learn.
So it also applies to us as parents, because
Yes.
we're never going to kind of get it right, and no matter how much and I think we need to have some remind ourselves of that as well. I mean, I embarrassingly, I was helping a child with needle phobia, and they had this coping strategy that they had developed, and I was really encouraging them to work on that coping strategy. And I had forgotten that the filter that this child views the world is one of being very sensitive to demands from adults. And so foolishly, I kind of was very enthusiastic about this, but it actually backfired. Through that child's perfectionistic filter, it felt like an impossible demand I was giving her. And fortunately, it worked out, but I was kind of going, oh boy, I am supposed to know better. And, cringe on me. But, fortunately, it didn't work out, but it just, I think we do need a certain amount of kind of compassion about not being kind of perfect, but just sort of being, as the phrase goes, kind of good enough.
Yep, I love that. I think it's very hard nowadays. There's been a lot written about socioculturally how there's so much pressure on parenting, that we're spending more time with our children, that we're expecting more intervention as parents, that, in this world, if your child's not doing well, there's a sense, what are the parents doing wrong? That's part of the, unfortunately, the legacy in my field. And I think you're right. Some people say that becoming a parent made their perfectionism worse over time because they felt now judged not only individually, but also by their children. I think you're absolutely right. Parenting is a place where it is impossible. It is impossible to be perfect ever, I think.
Dr. Schwab, you want to unmute?
Thanks. Hi. Thank you. This is really interesting to me to get learn a lot about perfectionism. And one of the things that comes to my mind is when I'm trying to treat certain entities, and there's not a DSM-5 diagnosis of perfectionism. It kind of is
No.
involved in many different things. But when I think of ADHD, I think of where is the anatomical problem? You know, we think of the anterior cortex for ADHD, or we think of anxiety as the amygdala. I'm curious as to whether there have been studies looking at this idea of perfectionism, and is there certain areas of the brain that are not working quite the way that they should be, and that might therefore have implications for treatment. Is there any of that work being done?
Probably not in the way you're describing it. That is, you made a good point, which is that perfectionism is not in our official diagnostic system, the DSM, for diagnosis. That is, you wouldn't, there is no way, like for example, health insurers you would give a diagnosis of perfectionism, and then insurers would cover the therapy for that. But it is kind of interlaced in all the different kinds of diagnoses. So I think that what you're talking about, kind of the biological substrate of perfectionism, is probably addressed a little bit better by looking at some of the clinical expressions of that. People talk often about amygdala, right? Talk about this often as an anxious system. There's people often talk about the behavioral activation system and inhibition system in this, which is a combination of both like the frontotemporal cortex, the executive functioning, and its association with the fear-based control, like the amygdala, as being places that are why am I losing the word? I'm being imperfect right now. That are prone to overactivation. Thank you. Prone to overactivation. And so, you know, it is true that people have tried to use some of the same medications we use for the clinical correlates, like antidepressant medications, which work very well with anxiety for perfectionism. And it seems to have a positive impact on many individuals. Not all, but many individuals. So it seems like biologically, it's not as if it is utterly distinct from its clinical correlates, which I know is a very inexact answer, but that's the best that it seems right now. And I think in some ways, because the perfectionism is not a DSM diagnosis, that we don't have the same kinds of fMRI studies and other kinds of things. In fact, I was really surprised that there was a twin study of perfectionism. It was done way back in 2004 by a group in Italy. But since then, there hasn't been a lot of replication of it. Whereas if you were to look up like genetic studies in anxiety, you would find 1,000 upon 1,000 of articles. So I don't think we have the insights that we need to all of the biological, like the neuroscientific perspectives on perfectionism that we probably need. We would, I think the best I have to offer is just what we've gathered already from some of the other clinical correlates. I don't know if that answers your question, Dr. Schwab.
Sure, no,
the best I have to offer.
Maybe not yet, but who
Yep.
knows in the future, maybe that will be something that we'll be able to find and then help those people with that in a different way.
Yep. Yeah, I certainly hope.
Any last questions or comments? All right. Well, why don't we stop here? And, you know, Patty, I'd just like to thank you so much for talking with us today. This has been, you know, really fantastic and so illuminating. And
thank you for having me. Thank you for taking time off of your very busy schedules to come and talk, and your questions are useful for making me think more about my own field. So I really do appreciate it. Take good care.